Hey guys, and welcome to session number 15 of the Trailer Music Composers Podcast. Hello everyone!
One man with one microphone who as a teenager found making a phone call incredibly scary. Welcome to the Trailer Music Composers Podcast.
Hey guys, welcome to another session of the Trailer Music Composers Podcast. Now, in this session, I wanted to talk about something which I would probably consider to be the most important tool in any composer's arsenal. This tool will help you in so many ways if you understand it and understand how to use it. It will help drive your track, it will help give your track dynamics, it will help give your track character, it will help give your track movement, it will help give your track pace. And it's something that I often fall back to, and the reason I like falling back on it or to it is it's such a simple idea, and you'll probably notice that, a lot of my teaching, a lot of the things I talk about fall back into incredibly simple ideas and simple terms because I used to teach young children music, and young children can compose music. We are all naturally inclined to creativity, whether you believe that in yourself or not. So if it's simple enough to young children to grasp, then it is simple enough for me to talk about in simple terms. And my students will know this because I say this a lot, this tool is simple. It is tension and release. This is the core of everything we do. All our harmonies are essentially manipulating tension to certain degrees and then releasing. All our melodies are using the same thing, tension and release. All our driving percussion is just understanding how to incorporate tension and release. All our effects, all our boims, all our risers, all our stutters, all our whooshes, they're all tension and release tools. Literally everything you could talk of in terms of music is some form of tension and release. Even using different timbres to help it bring the idea of tension and release. A screeching metal sound over some lovely wooden percussion would incorporate tension, and then the disappearance of that sound, the silence, will be the release. There are so many levels to this simple thing, tension and release, that I'm not sure I could really talk about it in as much depth as I'd like to without sitting down at my piano. And as I'm sure you probably guessed already, as I'm walking around in a wood, I can't really bring my piano with me. Well, I could, but it would be a real faff. So I'm going to talk about it in terms of how we as trailer composers can and do use it. So for those of you who are new to the trailer composing game, you can understand how this tool essentially structures your cue. Because, much like life, tension and release is different levels of cycles. So the whole cue is one long cycle of tension, and the end of the cue is the release. And then within that cue there are then acts. So in trailer music we'll have our 3 acts. Some may say 4, but I like to stick to the 3-act structure. We have 3 acts that are then smaller levels of tension and release. Act 1 is one level of building tension and release, and Act 2 the same, Act 3 the same. The way you could see it rather than cycles is like a rising slope, like a wedge. So the start of your cue is the small end of the wedge, the end of your cue is the big end of the wedge. And then the same within that, there will be smaller rises up and down, and obviously the wedge going up is the tension building, and the drop at the end of the wedge is the release. Much like you'd see on any stock market graph, actually, these patterns in music and these patterns we create visually, they're everywhere, because our whole world and life is filled with cycles and patterns. So going back to it in a more musical way, so we have our whole piece, one build of tension, and then our acts are 3 separate builds of tension and then a release. And then within our acts, whether we use, a chord sequence, which would itself be its own cycle of tension and release, and then within that chord sequence, each chord has a function of building tension and releasing. So, that's why we have the tradition in Western composition of usually using certain chords at the end of a sequence, because they are the ones that have the most tension as they release into the start of the chord sequence. So for instance, ending on the 5th chord, the dominant chord, the dominant 7, whatever you want to use, the dominant 9, whatever, that has the most tension as you then release into your first chord, be that the root chord or whatever the start of your chord sequence is. And then there'll be other ones that have similar tension but not quite as much. So the 3rd chord, usually a minor chord, will have that tension and release as well. And that's in more traditionally music terms. If we were doing a sound design trailer, we'd be using other things, namely texture and dynamics and rhythm, to bring tension, and a lot of the tools we as trailer composers use on a regular day-to-day basis are there to build tension. So risers, they build tension by using pitch and dynamics. Swish hits use tension by using texture. Obviously risers use texture as well, but using texture and dynamics again. Stutters, texture, dynamics, and rhythm. So it's using those 7 basic tools of music to create tension. And obviously the release is the release, either a release as in silence, or a drop in dynamics, or a drop in texture, or a return home to a root chord or a root note. So if you're doing sound design, it's probably just returning back to the root note bass pulse that you're doing, or the root note drone that you've got going on. And that's how we structure our cues. Essentially, the most basic thing that we do as trailer composers to bring tension and release is dynamics. So if you imagine that you've got an entire 2-minute 20 track for a trailer cue, you could essentially have a whole orchestra playing a single note. So let's say the whole orchestra, from strings to woods to brass to tuned percussion to percussion, all essentially playing one note, and that one note is, let's say, A. So like the orchestra have just tuned to concert A 440, and we start our piece of A. This is my trailer cue in A. Act 1 would be a slow build in dynamics. I could use sort of pulsing, bop, 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 like that, but I'm just going to use drones essentially. Act 1 starts very, very quietly and gradually builds up to, let's say, a mezzo forte, and then we have a slight drop into Act 2, which is where we return to mezzo piano, and actually the whole orchestra builds and swells into forte. So we've got loud by the end of Act 2, and then there's a drop to silence before Act 3, and then we start in forte again, and because of the drop to silence, forte feels even louder because of the direct comparison in dynamics. And then the forte then builds to I've forgotten what it's called, triple F, fortissimo, something like that, into blooming loud. So all you've done there is you've created an entire cue using dynamics and obviously texture and timbre because of the different instrumentation, to create the basic structure of a trailer cue. Now, if you don't understand the basic structure of a trailer cue, it's that simple. It's 3 acts usually building upon each other. That's the most basic. One little wedge building up to a slightly bigger wedge, building up to a slightly bigger wedge, and then a drop, and perhaps a very tiny wedge right at the end. And that's what we're doing every time we sit down to write a trailer cue. We're essentially going, how can we fill these wedges with sounds, and what sounds can we use to make mini wedges within those wedges? I feel like this should be on a cheese podcast. Let's talk about wedges. Anyway, And this is why it's the most important tool to be able to grasp. And I try to get this across to my students. If you can take the most minimal material and make it feel like you are going through those motions, then you have done your job. Obviously, you know, they might want more than just a single note played by an entire orchestra, but you know, they might just want that. There was what was that Brad Pitt movie recently? The space one. Wish I could remember names. You know the one. And the trailer for that is just a beautifully orchestrated rise of, like, I think it was a single note, but because of the use of colour and texture from the instrumentation and the dynamics and the timbre as well, it just felt fantastic. It was like this wonderful explosion of colour, but it was so simple. It was just fantastic. And that's what we're doing as composers. That was an excellent example of tension and release at its most basic. And, you know, if you listen to any sound design trailers, you can hear what they're doing. If you ignore the fact that I don't know how to use my synths like this, how do I get those cool robot sounds? Ignore that stuff, just for now. Just listen to some of those sound design trailers and just sit back and think, they're building tension, boom, release. They're building more tension, release. And then once you've got the idea behind it, their basic use of wedges, dynamic wedges, then you can start to hear, okay, now how are they doing wedges with colour? So I've talked about using dynamics, but you then develop let's return back to our orchestral cue playing an A, right? Say you start this cue off, as you know, a huge percentage of trailers do, with a harmonic played by the violins. There's one colour. Then within Act 2, the violas then start to creep in with their A in harmonics. Then the cellos creep in with their A in harmonics, and then the basses creep in with their harmonics in A, and they just swell. Boom, Act 2 drops. Dynamically we drop a touch, but then we bring in a new colour. The horns are coming in a chorale fashion, you know, they're all coming in with their A, just gradually building. Admittedly, these guys are going to need to take a breath, so maybe you'll have mini wedges from them. So you're introducing rhythm, but what you're really thinking about is colour. How can I grow this wedge using colour and orchestration and texture? And then I'm sticking with the brass, so I'm going to add in some trombones, and they've got that lovely raspy farty sound which we all love and also at the same time dislike, because it's, you know, quite hard to handle, but it's there to bring grit to it. The strings, of course, have switched from harmonics to just simple arco bowing. Nothing fancy. Maybe they're a bit close to the bridge, you know, just so it's a bit sharper, a bit spikier. And then within those, they will obviously be swelling in dynamics. The horns and the trombones are obviously they're not doing one long massive dynamic rise, but not dynamic build. They'll be doing smaller ones, but each one is progressively getting louder. And what you find with all instruments is as they get louder, the texture changes, because the way the reeds, the way the lips, the way the strings vibrate changes. And that's another thing that's naturally happening when you're doing this. You're also adding not just colour, but you're adding more texture. So you've got your strings and your brass swelling in Act 2, and then what happens, it builds to the end of Act 2, and just at the end of Act 2 you do a timpani roll in A. Vroom. Boom, we go into Act 3. So I'm trying to do this in real basic terms, just so that I don't have to sit there with a piano. And, you know, although I've done so many Logic tutorials, YouTube tutorials on, you know, how I build my tracks, but it's nice for me to talk about it in this simple term. We land into Act 3, everyone's playing louder, so the textures have changed, and we've got our horns and our trombones and all four of our strings, but now we bring in the tubas, now we bring in the bass trombones, now we bring in the trumpets, now we bring in the bassoon, now we bring in the flute, now we bring in all these other colours. And that in itself is a new wedge that's slightly bigger, because the sound is fuller, the texture is fuller, the colour is fuller. And then you just bring that home to a ginormous climax. Done. And then we finish with maybe a single A wedge played by the brass. Yes, in fact the thing is, I'm talking about this, walking in the woods. I want to go back home and try this out because it sounds like a lot of fun. And this is what we do when we do sound design. We're usually sticking to a root note, if we're honest with you. Occasionally we'll bring in some other notes that have a more tension, but we're basically sticking to a root note, and we're using textures and colours. So rather than the traditional orchestra, we're thinking, okay, well, how can I record my squeaking door and make that a cool sound? And that's what you're doing. And then when we have things like Brahms are basically just mini wedges in themselves, or at least huge, fat, distant wedges that sound like a battle cry. And every tool we have, I want you to reconsider its use and its possibilities in the terms of a little tension and release wedge. So it might not even be a wedge of tension. It might not be a building wedge. It might be a reverse wedge. So it starts loud and there it has a tail. The tension is immediate, and then it gradually peters off into release, which is what Brahms do. Boom, tension. That's what hits do. Although hits have will usually have a pre-hit rise into them, So they'll have the tension leading up with a bigger spike in tension. It's almost like the waveform itself is a visual representation of the tension and release. And if you look at the waveforms of trailer cues, you will notice there is a big wedge. It starts quiet, gets louder, boom, end. And that's what we're doing as composers. This is the most amazing tool. So then let's take this a little bit further, right? We're going back to our orchestral A track, right? We start with our Act 1. We'll keep that just one note, A. Gradually growing in dynamics, adding a couple more textures in there, with maybe a slight quiet timp roll into Act 2. In Act 2, let's think of another way we can bring in tension. We could bring in rhythmic tension, we could bring in more texture, we could bring in more timbre, we could bring in rhythm, and that's what I'm going to bring in here, rhythm as a tension. I'm going to bring in, let's say, violin twos playing an ostinato. So the rhythm itself doesn't necessarily create like a tension and release thing, but it ultimately does, because the sound is the tension and the release is the quiet. But what we're thinking here is, I'm thinking, okay, maybe I bring in some other notes to add tension to that root note that we have going on. And the note you choose will determine the tonality of your cue from this point. Because at the moment we're just root notes. There's no tonality. It could be minor, it could be major, we don't know yet. So if you went in for, say, an A and a C, we're immediately in a minor cue. The whole track is changed. If I went in for an A and a C sharp, we're in a major key. Immediately this track is hopeful. So you see, the slightest change in tension from a C, a minor third, to a C sharp, major third, is going to bring a different feeling to your track. So you see, as soon as you start incorporating more and more ideas, more and more techniques to your cue, your simple tension and release wedge becomes very, very different. The tension is different. There is always tension in every piece of music, whether it's like crazy dark tension from a sound design cue, or whether it's just it's a major sort of family adventure, very uplifting cue, but there will be tension in there, because there has to be within the melodies and the harmonies that you're choosing. So returning back to I'm going to choose obviously a minor, because that's my default, especially A minor. Hello. So I'm going to choose an ostinato that just goes C to A minor. Dun, 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 dun. Classic. So I've introduced something now. What we have here is, now you have to see it like this. That in itself is a new layer of wedges that then need to feel like they're building. I can't just keep that going, because it won't be a wedge, it won't be tension and release, it will be on a micro form but not on a macro form. We need it to feel like, okay, this is a part of, there's tension building, but we now need to give some level of release, or at least keep the tension building. So you do that by adding new parts or by changing the existing part. I mean, this in itself, I could keep going for quite some time, going on about how I can then develop my C to A in my A minor track ostinato, how I can develop this into a whole cue. But I'm using it as a very, very simple explanation as to how we then use tension and release. So this is providing tension, right? Because it's driving the track forward, it's adding tonality, and then what you can do, you've got your A in the brass still swelling and pulsing, and you've got your A in your strings, and you've got your ostinato coming in. So your choice now is, how do you then take that ostinato to bring more tension? So there are countless ways. My usual go-to is to add another ostinato that's moving in a different way. So rather than bum 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 bum, it might be going in the arpeggio, and that's how we then do it as composers. We've essentially started an ostinato, and we want to feel like there's a wedge, there's a development, a build going on. We take our C-A ostinato, and we, in the second violins, and we push it into the first violins, but instead of just C and A, they're going A, up an octave A, down to E, down to C, do da 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 do da da da, or, no, that's not right, is it? Do da, A, E, C, B, do da 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 do da da da, something like that. And again, what I would do there is I would bring that in as tension against the existing ostinato, because we're not releasing this. This is what ostinatos do really well. This is what riffs do really well. They keep the tension going. So they in themselves are a longer, a bigger wedge within our Act 2 or Act 3 or whatever it is you're doing. They are our bigger building tension, and you increase the tension by increasing the amount of notes, the pitch of the notes, the dynamics of the notes, and that's what I would simply do. Just get them to do a build. Just keep building, guys, keep building into Act 3, etc, etc. So if you find you are encountering the issue of, my track is stagnating, my track feels like a giant loop, my track feels boring, how do I develop my cue? Return back to the wedge. Return back to tension and release. If you notice that you've got essentially like a loop happening for your entire Act 2, the tension and release isn't going to work, because it's not really releasing. Because you're not developing the idea, you're not building the track, and that is the key here to how tension and release really works for us trailer composers. Is the track building? Is it growing constantly and consistently? You can sort of every bar add a new instrument, and you'd give it the sense of development, of growth, of building, and that's what you've got to do. So if you're like Act 2, the publisher comes back to you and says that, love the ideas, but it kind of feels a bit looped in Act 2, can you do something about it? You go, sure can. I think, how can I add tension and release? Boom, first step, riser. Hello! That's one of the easiest and quickest ways to make a loop feel like it's growing and building. The other one is dynamics. Have you played around with your automation in your velocities, in your volumes of your instrumentation? Have you explored growing this cue with automation? Yes or no? Have you explored, if yes to those, yes to the riser, have you explored growing this cue in pitch? And what I mean by that is, traditionally on the rise to a climax of a track, of a piece of music, there will be not a flourish per se, when you hear it in classical music, you will hear a flourish on the dominant to the tonic chord climax at the end, the cadence, I should say. you will hear a flourish. And what you can do is simple terms for us trailer music composers, because come on, we want it all in simple terms. You just take your ostinato and you change the voicing. So if your ostinato is going A, E, C, B, that's up to A and then down back to, up to E and then down back to A. Then you take your bottom A, chuck it up an octave, so you're actually going A, down to E, down to C, down to B. Then the next bar you chuck your B up, so you go A, down to E, down to C, up to B, and then you do that each bar, gradually getting your ostinato to progress up in pitch, and that will make your track feel like the tension is growing. And you do that the same with long chords. You increase the voicing's pitch. You can either just move the voicings within the parts, so violin twos, they're sort of gradually going up in pitch, or you just add new elements. So you get the divisi parts where each chair within a section will be adding a new note. So the chord becomes more dense and more rich. But you're using pitch to build it. Are you using timbre to help it feel like it's growing? If you've done all of those things so far and your publisher's still saying, dude, it feels looped, then maybe you add a new element with a new timbre. So is there a metal sound in there that we can add? Is there a wood sound? What sounds have you got, and what does it need to feel like it's developing? And as trailer music composers, when we're using sound design specifically, and when we're using orchestration in our big epic tracks, we're thinking in terms of metals, woods, strings, reeds, brass. All this stuff is just adding another level of colour, timbre, to our track. Are we using texture to build? Is there something you can do? This is why we have so many lovely string articulations, so many lovely brass articulations. You go from chorale brass playing to cuivre, so it's like, it goes from lovely like to gritty, dirty, farty, lovely brassy sounds. Are you doing these things? Are you exploring the articulations to get different textures? And if you're not in orchestral writing, you just think in terms of sounds around the house or sounds on your synth. Everything here is rooted in a sine wave. Maybe I will bring in some sawtooths in here just to give it some more, nasty, gritty, synthy sounds. Admittedly, synthesis is, I will not even going to say my strong point. It's the distant cousin of my strong point. It's something I very rarely touch. I like to work fast and quick, so I very rarely dive into my synths beyond presets or mucking around with the most basic of filters, etc. But if that is your jam, think in terms of texture, and that's what synthesis is really. You're building the texture using different waves. Different sound waves. Now I kind of feel like the tension of this podcast is going to be releasing soon, so don't worry. But what I want you to take away from this is, when you're entering any kind of trailer music, whether you're going in full epic orchestral, whether you're going in hybrid, whether you're going in organic sound design, whether you're going in horror strings, whether you're going into swagger drums, whether you're going into tribal percussion, any form of trailer music, I want you to think about the wedge, the tension and release, and the build. Are you utilising those most basic tools? And the thing is, I'm talking in these terms because I don't want to exclude people who don't understand theory to the same level as me. I don't want to exclude people who don't understand sound waves to the same level as me, or even effects, or even just talking about production to the same level as me, because I am by no means a whiz on any of those things. But what I like to do is I like to return back to the simple things that I can discuss with any composer, any person who's interested in sound. Does this feel building? Where's the release? Where's the tension? Just ask yourself that when you listen to a track, especially a track that you're not really keen on. and it's, might be a bit of a shift of mindset for you, but you can even look at a riff as a tension and release, especially there's the brilliant metal riffs that you get sort of climbing up and down all those lovely modes that they've got there. They will essentially return back to the root note at some point. That's the release. If you can't hear the tension and release, it might just be so quick and small. The wedge might be so minuscule that it's quite hard to detect, but it's there. So go back to your DAW. That's your digital audio workstation, whether that's Logic or Cubase or all those other ones that I've never heard of, and start playing around with that basic wedge shape. Just load up a simple drone and play with the automation of that level, of that instrument, and you will find that actually you can load up, if you load up a single drone and do the wedge gradually getting bigger and bigger, building upon itself, increasing tension, and the release is always in there too, you'll find you can copy and paste that note and automation onto loads of different sounds, and you've got yourself an incredibly basic trailer cue. Just chuck in some hits, a couple of risers, job done. In fact, I'm going to go and do that when I get home, because that sounds like a lot of fun. Right, I really hope that you not only got something from this, but actually kind of enjoyed it, because I like talking in basic terms when it comes to music, because music is something we all share, so there should be some commonality in the language as well. Basically, I'm doing it in English. I don't know any other languages, but hey, sorry guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'd love to hear anything that you write based on what I'm teaching you. And if you're one of my students, take this on board for all the briefs that I set you. How can I keep this building? Because quite often the tracks that I get submitted from students and other aspiring composers alike, they're great, the ideas are great, they just haven't grasped tension and release and building. They've essentially given me 3 loops: Act 1 loop, Act 2 loop, Act 3 loop. Yes, Act 3 is bigger sounding than Act 1, but there isn't a growth and a build in the acts themselves. There isn't a feeling of development, there isn't a feeling of growing tension and release. So, you want to send me some tracks? Make sure you've got that in the bag. And that's what you do in those lovely horror cues, those all these lovely weird sounds, just like micro tensions and release. Okay, I'm going off piste again, aren't I? I'm getting too excited about it. Go home, if you're not already at home, that is, and have a play, just with that little simple exercise I gave you, just a long note and the automation, expanding those wedges, and see how it sounds. And then you think, okay, well, how can I do that with other instruments? How can I do that with harmony? It's so much fun. And then you can make the wedges smaller, and then it becomes like this wonderful, growing Steve Reich cue. Steve Reich's an absolute legend, and his music is obviously huge and has inspired me and thousands, if not more, other musicians. Now, thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I do really appreciate it. Love it if you could leave a rating and a review for the podcast. Head on over to the Trailer Music School, check out the courses. You want to sign up for the membership, that's amazing too. Great to see you in the community. Peace.